Welcome back for another episode. Before we start, please leave a comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is right now. Also, leave a like and subscribe. All the cases I cover on this channel are real true crime cases from around the world. Let's get to it. That bee is dead. The words hit the neighborhood like an alarm bell. It was posted from Dee Dee Blanchard's Facebook account on a humid June afternoon. Neighbors called, knocked, then watched police step into the small pink house on West Volunteer Way. Inside, they found a knife on the floor and a bedroom door closed. Dee Dee was in bed, stabbed. Her daughter, Gypsy, was missing. Her wheelchair still parked by the couch. Oxygen tank standing by the door. Panic rolled through Springfield. To understand the body and the post, we need to go back, years earlier, to a pink house and a daughter who wasn't supposed to walk. Before the pink house and the prizes, there was a childhood in Louisiana where Dee Dee learned how to get what she needed by managing other people's attention. Family would later talk about patterns, controlling, secretive, a person who held grudges and shifted stories when pressed. She'd cared for her mother near the end, and there were whispers about pills, about a checkbook. Nothing was proven in court, but the idea of control, of making someone dependent and then directing their life, followed her. When Gypsy was born in July 1991, the world saw something else. A young mother with a sick baby. First came allergies, then seizures. Soon, doctors' notes grew crowded. Leukemia, muscular dystrophy, developmental delays. Each visit added a layer. Dee Dee spoke in calm, practiced sentences, listing symptoms as if reading from a script. The files traveled doctor to doctor, and when records didn't, her memory filled in the blanks. Wheelchairs appear in stories like checkpoints. In this one, Dee Dee said Gypsy needed one by grade school. She shaved Gypsy's head so the chemo would be easier. She carried thick binders of medication lists, anti-seizure drugs, pain relievers, muscle relaxants, then night oxygen, because Dee Dee said Gypsy stopped breathing sometimes. She talked about feeding tubes and aspiration risks. Nurses saw a devoted mother who never left her daughter's side. Volunteers leaned in to help. Meanwhile, test results often came back normal or inconclusive, but the paper trail was messy. Records were fragmented across clinics and states. A pediatrician in one town didn't have the MRI notes from another. A specialist relied on Dee Dee's history because the prior hospital hadn't sent files. In that chaos, Dee Dee's story became the glue holding the illusion together. A new doctor read muscular dystrophy and didn't always retest. A hospital saw seizure meds and assumed epilepsy. The system trusted parent testimony. After Hurricane Katrina, Dee Dee and Gypsy relocated from Louisiana to Missouri. The narrative landed in a generous community. Local news featured them. The child's voice was high and small. The mother's smile was soft and grateful. Habitat for Humanity built them a pastel house with a wheelchair ramp, a jacuzzi for sore muscles, and a front lawn that became a stage for kindness. Charities brought meals, a new van with a wheelchair lift, and a trip to Disney. In photographs, Gypsy wore princess dresses and a knitted hat that hid her scalp. She waved from her chair and thanked donors in a voice that sounded years younger than her age. Inside the house, the ritual continued. Dee Dee set alarms for medications. She crushed pills into applesauce. She scheduled appointments. She wheeled Gypsy through big box stores late at night when the aisles were empty and quiet. When people asked questions, Dee Dee answered first. "She's 12, she'd say, when Gypsy was older. She was born in 95, even though she wasn't. She handled the documents, kept the birth certificate tucked away, and told school officials it was better to homeschool. Doctors' offices called her Mom and asked her to clarify histories. Nurses saw her sleep in plastic chairs next to hospital beds. The story had a cadence that never changed. A cough was pneumonia, leg weakness was muscular dystrophy, nausea meant the feeding tube wasn't taking. When a dentist questioned why Gypsy's teeth were decaying, Dee Dee blamed medication and special diets. When a physician noted that test results didn't confirm leukemia, Dee Dee moved to another practice. She was always cheerful, always available, always ready with a binder. She took comfort in the attention that came with being the mother who never quit. Praise followed her through waiting rooms and charity events. There were human moments that made it convincing. A medication cabinet stacked with labeled syringes and pill organizers. A breathing mask that left red marks on Gypsy's cheeks in the morning. Disney trips where Gypsy met characters, took photos, then returned to the hotel for rest, as Dee Dee told staff. Volunteers remembered how Gypsy's eyes lit up when they brought cupcakes. Church members described how Dee Dee hugged them and cried quietly when talking about hospital bills. People delivered gift cards and stuffed animals to the porch. Gypsy would smile and say thank you in a soft, practiced way. Around neighbors, the presentation was polished. Dee Dee explained that Gypsy had developmental delays and couldn't keep up in classrooms. She said Gypsy's father had left and sent some money, but they managed. The narrative created a closed loop: a sick child, a devoted mother, a community that cared. When you saw Gypsy in a wheelchair with a bald head and an IV port scar, you didn't doubt the medical story. You saw courage, but there were cracks if you looked close. Gypsy's legs sometimes pressed against the footrests with more strength than expected. An oxygen tank travelled with them, yet nurses rarely saw oxygen saturation drops in the charts. The feeding tube made meals complicated, but Gypsy sometimes ate pudding or soft foods with no issue. These weren't smoking guns. They were moments that didn't quite fit. At home, Gypsy learned the scripts. She repeated symptoms because that's what the world expected. She used a childlike voice because adults leaned in and smiled when she did. She let nurses lift her, even when she wanted to stand. She watched other girls at events run and dance. At night, she looked at posters of princesses and wondered about bedrooms without hospital beeps. Dee Dee accepted the attention as if it were currency. She knew which office had samples, which charity had a waiting list for grants, which local reporter liked feel-good stories. She prepared for visitors like a stage manager, meds organized, wheelchair polished, a soft blanket folded over Gypsy's knees. When someone questioned a diagnosis, Dee Dee had a new explanation, a previous doctor's name, a lost set of records. If a doctor hesitated, she changed doctors. If a teacher asked for testing, she switched to homeschooling. If a friend asked too many questions, she found a new friend. Behind closed doors, control didn't look like kindness. Gypsy's head was shaved even when no chemo was scheduled. Her ears heard whispers through doors. Don't tell them that. She learned that independence meant trouble. When she tried to stand, Dee Dee scolded her. When she asked about school, Dee Dee said, "You're too sick." The message was clear. Survival required obedience. The pink house became a landmark, a symbol of good people doing good things. It had a ramp that invited wheelchairs, a mailbox stuffed with get-well cards, and a porch light that made the place look safe. Visitors saw that and felt part of something pure. They didn't see the files that didn't add up, or the way Gypsy's eyes tracked the door when someone mentioned hospitals. But there was one problem. None of it added up for long. To understand how the story held, you have to see the machinery that kept it running. Munchausen by proxy isn't a single act. It's a system built around a caregiver's need for attention and validation. The caregiver learns the rhythms of clinics, the language of symptoms, and the grey areas where medical uncertainty lives. Dee Dee worked those spaces. She collected diagnoses like tokens, and each token opened another door, to specialists, to charities, to praise that felt like proof her life mattered. The power sits in the caregiver's hands because medicine often begins with history, and history, in pediatrics, comes from parents. Dee Dee learned how to present a clean story, onset in infancy, consistent symptoms, a long list of therapies that helped a little, but not enough. She'd bring a folder and speak with confidence. She'd note allergies, developmental delays, episodes that only she had seen. When tests didn't show the expected problem, the diagnosis shifted, not the narrative. Epilepsy became seizure-like activity. Muscular dystrophy became neuromuscular weakness. Leukemia became immune problems. The labels were flexible. The role was fixed. Her strategies were direct. When a doctor hesitated, she found another. When records were missing, she called it a paperwork issue. She learned which clinics accepted verbal histories and which demanded original files. She knew that new providers often gave deference to prior diagnoses, especially with complex patients. If a medication caused a side effect, that side effect became a new symptom. If a procedure left a scar, the scar proved severity. She managed appointments like a conductor, every note reinforcing the next. Documents were her terrain: birth certificates, Medicaid cards, hospital wristbands, prescription labels, each became a prop. She corrected Gypsy's age in conversation, made her younger to keep her within pediatric systems and maintain the image of a child needing care. She held the binder, handled the signatures, escorted Gypsy to bathrooms, answered questions before they were asked. The message to professionals was clear. She knew this child better than anyone. Isolation was part of the design. School meant teachers, counselors, mandated reporters, so school disappeared. Homeschooling kept Gypsy in the house and out of sight. Friends meant questions, so visits were short and supervised. Phone calls were monitored. Letters weren't encouraged. Even family from Louisiana saw Gypsy through Dee Dee's story, not through independent relationships. The fewer perspectives in Gypsy's life, the stronger Dee Dee's narrative became. Red flags did surface. Physicians saw normal labs that didn't match the reported disorders. Neurological exams showed tone and reflexes that suggested intact function. Sleep studies didn't capture dangerous apnea, yet the chart listed oxygen at night. Some clinicians documented inconsistencies, but the system rarely connected the dots across states and providers. A doctor in Missouri didn't automatically see notes from Louisiana. An ER nurse might suspect over-reporting, but discharge the patient when vitals were fine. Without a single catastrophic event, suspicion turned into shrugs. For Gypsy, the stakes were life-shaping. She lost autonomy, then the sense of what autonomy was. Unnecessary procedures became markers of identity. A feeding tube replaced meals at a table. Hospital bracelets replaced friendship bracelets. She learned to be a patient before she learned to be a person. That training sinks deep. When your world tells you you're fragile, you start to move in ways that protect the story, not your body. There were small moments where the mask slipped. At a dentist visit, the doctor worried about crumbling teeth and asked about hygiene. Dee Dee explained medication damage and genetic issues. Gypsy sat silent, swallowing questions about why she sometimes brushed, but was told it wasn't safe to stand at the sink alone. During a feeding tube change, a nurse watched Gypsy glance at a vending machine with a look that wasn't hunger so much as longing. The nurse made a note. Patient appears capable of oral intake. Caregiver reports aspiration risk. In an ER, a nurse bent close and whispered, "You seem stronger than you look." Gypsy smiled and tucked the words away like contraband. Meanwhile, the daily routine cemented dependency. Medications arrived on a strict schedule. Sleep came with the hiss of oxygen that monitors never recorded as necessary. Wheelchair wheels squeaked across tile, even when Gypsy's legs pressed against the footrests. In public, Dee Dee asked for assistance that trained Gypsy to be passive. Help us lift, help us transfer, help us navigate. Staff obliged, because helping felt kind, and kindness felt right in the presence of a mother so devoted. Control extended to language. Dee Dee answered with "we" instead of "she." We're sick. We're tired. We're doing our best. That "we" fused mother and daughter into a single medical identity. It made dissent feel like betrayal. If Gypsy said she felt okay, Dee Dee reframed it. She has good days and bad days. If Gypsy asked to walk, Dee Dee reminded her of falls she'd never had. Correcting the record would mean admitting the role was built on sand. It's hard to do that when the audience claps. The incentives around them were powerful. Charities met need with generosity, not investigation. Neighbors saw a house with a ramp and assumed the vetting was done by someone else. Reporters spotlighted bravery, not discrepancies. Even clinicians, facing packed schedules and complex cases, often focused on the immediate complaint, not the narrative underpinning it. In that environment, a determined caregiver can keep a story intact for years. Munchausen by proxy thrives in ambiguity. Medicine accepts that rare conditions exist and that some patients present atypically. It's a profession built on trust and probability. Dee Dee exploited both. She learned a vocabulary, spells, episodes, intolerance, exacerbation, and how to use it to keep Gypsy in treatment, lanes that were hard to exit. Once a label like muscular dystrophy lands in a chart, it shadows every exam. To remove it requires time, testing, and a willingness to confront a parent who seems selfless. For Gypsy, the body became contested ground. Pain was expected, so she described it. Weakness was assumed, so she performed it. Over time, her own signals got drowned out by the script. That's learned helplessness. The belief that no action changes the outcome. She stopped asking for school. She stopped trying to stand when someone was watching. She stopped trusting that her perception mattered more than the chart. Yet the machine wasn't perfect. A few providers wrote down their doubts. A social worker noted inconsistencies but closed the file when nothing actionable surfaced. A pharmacist raised an eyebrow at overlapping prescriptions but filled them. These were embers, not flames. They needed oxygen, communication, coordinated records. A champion willing to push. Without that, the machine kept humming. Meanwhile, someone started to notice, quietly, and wrote it down. In 2011, a pediatric neurologist in Springfield opened the chart and paused. Doctor. Bernardo Flasterstein scanned the diagnoses: muscular dystrophy, seizures, developmental delay, and the tangle of medications that supposedly held it all at bay. He'd seen complex cases. He'd also seen stories that leaned too hard on history. He met Gypsy with a gentle exam and careful questions. Dee Dee answered most of them. He asked Gypsy to relax, then to push against his hands. Her legs didn't look like a child with muscular dystrophy. They looked strong. Stakes were high in that small exam room. If he accepted the history, Gypsy stayed on a path of permanent dependence. If he challenged it, he risked alienating a parent and a patient. He watched Gypsy's eyes as she followed instructions. Reflexes fired. Tone felt normal. There wasn't the expected muscle wasting. He asked about seizures. Dee Dee described episodes no one else had documented clearly. He asked about the feeding tube. Dee Dee said oral intake was dangerous. The answers stayed too neat. He wrote in his notes, "Suspected Munchausen by proxy. The action that followed was cautious and standard." He recommended weaning unnecessary medications. He suggested re-evaluation of the muscular dystrophy label. He documented his concerns in the chart. He contacted a primary care provider and shared his impressions. The impact should have been immediate. An alarm pulled in the middle of a crowded building. But what nobody tells you is how quiet alarms sound in fragmented systems. His suspicions circulated among a few providers. It didn't spark a coordinated intervention. Meanwhile, Dee Dee sensed trouble. She'd handled skepticism before. She brought thicker binders to future visits. She referenced previous specialists by name and hospital. She requested copies of test results and carried them herself. When a provider questioned her, she pivoted, highlighted a history from Louisiana, or changed clinics. She understood the medicine of momentum. Keep moving, and people won't stop you. A social worker did come to the house. The stakes there were different. If she saw abuse, Gypsy could be removed. If she didn't, the file would close. Dee Dee rehearsed, the way she always did. Gypsy sat in her chair, quiet, hands folded. The oxygen sat nearby like a prop that never spoke. The social worker asked private questions. Gypsy didn't contradict her mother. Fear kept her inside the script. Dee Dee's warmth helped too. She offered sweet tea, medical records, and a tour of the medication cabinet. The visit ended without decisive action. Police knocked once as well, after an anonymous tip. A wellness check is a blunt instrument. Officers can observe, ask, and note conditions, but without visible harm, they can't tear apart a medical narrative validated by doctors. Dee Dee presented the wheelchair, the prescriptions, the calendar of appointments on the fridge. She spoke softly about chronic conditions and a father out of state. The officers left with the impression of a tired but loving caregiver. Dee Dee weaponized records and charm like armor. Inside Gypsy, something shifted. The doctor's exam had marked her. She'd felt her own legs push and be seen. Doubt grew quietly, like a plant on a shaded windowsill. She started asking small questions in safe places. Could she try walking in the kitchen when Dee Dee was asleep? Could she stand a little longer? When Dee Dee caught her, punishment followed. A slap, a threat, a reminder of how fragile she really was. The message was clear. The story would not change, but Gypsy found a portal. A discarded laptop appeared in the house, supposedly for simple games, mostly for Dee Dee to manage appointments and Facebook. At night, Gypsy opened it. She searched for terms that had been used about her. She read about muscular dystrophy and didn't see herself. She typed "how to know your age" and scrolled through answers that didn't help. Then she found forums and fan pages that let her be someone else. She created aliases and made friends. The internet didn't see a wheelchair. It only saw words. The secret laptop changed the stakes again. With it, Gypsy had a space where Dee Dee couldn't shape the narrative in real time. She learned about birth certificates and how to request them. One day, she found a document at home that didn't match her mother's claims. The numbers told a different story. She was older than she'd been told. She held that paper like a match she couldn't light yet. It confirmed the feeling that had been whispering since the neurologist's office. The world outside their pink house followed different rules. Meanwhile, cracks widened in quiet places. A pharmacist asked why certain meds were being refilled when dosages were unusual for a child. Dee Dee smiled and mentioned a specialist. A nurse at a clinic noted that Gypsy's respiratory metrics looked normal during apnea events. A dentist wondered why extraction after extraction led to no broader investigation. Each note landed in separate files. No single page told the whole truth. Dr. Flasterstein didn't let it go. He maintained his suspicion in the record, wrote that he felt the child was a victim of caregiver fabrication, and recommended contacting Child Protective Services. He understood that not every case would trigger immediate action. He also understood liability. By putting it in the chart, he created a trail. In medical ethics, documentation is both shield and signal. He hoped it would protect Gypsy later, if not now. For Gypsy, the immediate impact was more complicated. She felt seen and more terrified. Dee Dee tightened control. She reduced unsupervised time. She leaned on the cruelty of kindness. "I'm the only one who knows what you need." Community applause reinforced her. The pink house filled with gifts and praise that made any external challenge look like an attack on a saint. There were micro moments that hinted at a different future. A volunteer once wheeled Gypsy to the porch and stepped inside to grab a sweater. For 3 seconds, Gypsy's toes touched the ground, bore weight, and then lifted again when tires squeaked. In a clinic hallway, a physical therapist watched Gypsy adjust herself on the chair with core strength that didn't match the chart. "She's stronger than expected," he wrote. The note stayed local to his system. The file, the one that mattered, wasn't a single binder in Dee Dee's hands. It was scattered across hospitals, offices, and agencies. If someone had stitched it together, you'd see a pattern. A mother who moved states as questions rose, a daughter who whispered yes to independence, and then swallowed it, professionals who suspected but didn't coordinate. The system punished uncertainty with inertia. What nobody knew at the time, Gypsy had a plan and internet access. She wasn't ready to break the story open with a call to police. That required proof she didn't believe she held and courage she wasn't sure she had. Instead, she started building a world where a different ending was possible. Profiles and friends, conversations after midnight, and soon, a message from a man in Wisconsin who thought he could be her rescue. At night, when the pink house finally went quiet, Gypsy opened the laptop. The glow on her face felt like sun through a crack in a boarded window. She started small: Disney fan pages, cosplay forums, places where a girl who loved princesses could talk about costumes and makeup. She created profiles with different names. Her voice online wasn't childlike. It was curious, quick, and hungry for connection. She posted late because Dee Dee slept light and patrolled mornings. Cosplay gave her a doorway. She saved photos of gowns, learned the difference between boning and bias tape, and watched tutorials on how to do eyeliner. On forums, people asked about ages and birthdays to meet up at conventions. She sidestepped dates, joked about being forever young, and kept chats moving. In that world, bodies moved freely, and she learned to write like someone who could move too. A message thread turned into a friendship with a woman who talked about identity and expression. In a private chat, Gypsy mentioned not knowing her real age. The woman told her, kindly, to check her vital records. That suggestion stayed with Gypsy for weeks. One afternoon, when Dee Dee went to the pharmacy, Gypsy opened a file box in the bedroom. She found a photocopy of a birth certificate that didn't match the year her mother always said. Her hands shook. She put the paper back exactly as she'd found it, then closed the box. A fact had landed with a thud inside her. The more she read, the more the script eroded. She searched muscular dystrophy signs, compared photos of muscle atrophy to her own legs, and didn't see a match. She read about epilepsy and recognized little. She typed, "Can someone make you sick for attention?" and found terms for what she was living. The words didn't free her, but they gave shape to the prison. In a Christian singles group, she met Nicholas Godejohn. He was older than the boyfriends in teen romances, but messaged with the intensity of someone who needed to be seen. He lived in Wisconsin, worked sporadically, and struggled with mental health. He talked about multiple personas, inner darkness, and redemption. He was blunt about his autism diagnosis. He liked fantasy worlds where heroes saved trapped girls. That language fit Gypsy's late-night dreams. Their chats accelerated. He stayed up late too. They built alter egos. She had a sweet persona and a darker one. He had a gentleman and a violent protector. The conversations drifted from movies to roleplay. BDSM terms entered the chat, clumsy and theatrical. It gave them a secret language, a private stage where Gypsy could be powerful and submissive by choice, not because her mother controlled her. Meanwhile, she pushed boundaries in the house. She hid a burner phone under her mattress, bought with gift cards and cash she tucked away when Dee Dee wasn't looking. She created a Facebook profile under a different name and added friends from cosplay groups. She ordered a wig online, soft brown hair with curls that bounced around her shoulders. She hid clothes too, heels, a dress, a cardigan that looked like something an adult would wear outside in daylight. The first attempt to meet Nicholas wasn't a plan. It was a test. He traveled to Missouri to accidentally meet at a movie theater. Gypsy convinced Dee Dee to see a live-action Cinderella. She wore a blue dress under a zip-up hoodie, heart beating hard enough to make the zipper buzz. Nicholas walked into the theater and sat near them. When Dee Dee went for popcorn, Gypsy and Nicholas exchanged words no one else heard. It felt like stepping into the same frame after months of being drawn in different panels. After the movie, they slipped into a bathroom hallway for minutes that felt like a lifetime. It was messy and awkward. Two people trying to make fantasy real in a public place with fluorescent lights. Then it was over. Dee Dee saw the shift in Gypsy's expression and sensed something off. Fury followed at home, a verbal barrage, threats, and a reminder that men were dangerous and that Gypsy was too sick to date. The leash pulled tight. That night, messages doubled. In private, Gypsy and Nicholas insisted to each other that they were meant to be. They fed each other stories of rescue and purity, of a future apartment, pets, and making pancakes at noon. They layered codependency over isolation until it felt like the only safe blanket. Red flags flew everywhere, his violent fantasies, her secrecy, the mismatched life skills. But in the dark, two lonely people saw only the parts they wanted. Gypsy told Nicholas more about the control at home. She described the medications, the shaved head, the threats when she tried to stand. He responded as a rescuer in a story might, by promising to remove the villain. At first, it was talk, run away, catch a bus, hide out. She looked up schedules and saved cash. Then reality intruded. Dee Dee controlled IDs and documents. Without them, Gypsy feared she'd be returned like a lost child, even though she wasn't a child anymore. The alter egos deepened their bond. She adopted names for different moods. He created a persona he called Victor, the side of him that didn't hesitate. They wrote scenes where Victor protected her from a mother who locked doors and counted pills. It was play acting, except the stakes weren't pretend. Each scene made the unthinkable more thinkable. Meanwhile, Dee Dee's world narrowed further. She didn't like the wig. She didn't like the dress. She found a message once and confiscated the laptop for a week. Gypsy learned to clear histories, to log out of accounts, to disguise apps. Control created creativity. Every locked door taught her how to look for hinges. On fan forums, Gypsy found kindness that didn't ask for medical proof. A woman mailed her a small makeup palette. A man sent a PDF of a sewing pattern when he realized she couldn't receive packages easily. Micro moments of generosity made the world outside feel less hostile. But they also highlighted what was missing inside the house. Freedom to make a mess, fail, and be seen as an adult. Nicholas pushed for a plan. He talked about buses and routes. Gypsy mapped the distance between Springfield and Big Bend, Wisconsin. She calculated how much cash she could skim without notice. She kept a list in her head. Phone, wig, dress, toothbrush. The stuffed animal she'd had since childhood. Running away always ended in a wall. Dee Dee's control and Gypsy's fear of being found, punished, and reset to zero. Their chats took a darker turn when they started testing the boundary between escape and violence. He asked what would happen if her mother wasn't there. She didn't answer at first. He asked again, softer, and she typed what she'd thought in the neurologist's office when she felt her own strength and realized the story might hold forever. They drifted across a line neither of them knew how to hold. They built their closeness around secrecy. The thrill of hiding fused with the seriousness of the stakes. Every time Gypsy snuck into the kitchen at night, she practiced moving without sound. Every time Nicholas wrote about Victor, he practiced stabbing words onto a screen. They told themselves they were planning a future. What they were building was a tunnel, with no map of where it exited. A small, human moment anchored all of it. One night, Gypsy stood in front of a mirror, wig on, eyeliner shaky but brave. She took a photo on the burner phone and sent it to Nicholas. He replied in seconds. He called her beautiful. It was the first time a boy had said that to her without talking about her being brave for being sick. She saved the message and looked at it again before hiding the phone. The plan seemed perfect, but they overlooked one thing. There would be blood. Stakes were simple in Gypsy's head and terrifying in practice. If she ran, Dee Dee would find her. If she stayed, the script never ended. She believed there was one way to break it. She and Nicholas circled the idea for weeks, writing it as fantasy, so they could say they didn't mean it. But each time they walked up to the line, it felt less like fiction and more like logistics. The fear wasn't just punishment. It was being dragged back into the chair, the oxygen mask, the shaved head, reset to a child she no longer was. Action needed tools. In late spring, Gypsy slipped cash from Dee Dee's envelope of bills, small amounts, never enough to notice in a week, but over time, it added up. She stashed the money with the burner phone and a folded bus schedule. In a pharmacy aisle, she examined pocket knives and backed away. Buying a blade in town felt dangerous. She messaged Nicholas to bring one. He agreed without hesitation. They debated gloves, latex or knit, settling on both. She proposed a detail that showed how far she'd travelled from fantasy into planning. Time the act, after Dee Dee took her nighttime medications, so she'd be asleep. Nicholas mapped buses from Wisconsin to Springfield. He bought tickets under his name, proud to be decisive. He told his mother he had a job lead. He packed dark clothes, gloves, and a knife he'd bought at a store where no one knew him. He carried cash and a prepaid card Gypsy had arranged. He put the items in a backpack and told himself this was what heroes carried. Logistics hardened. Gypsy would leave the door unlocked. She'd tape a kitchen knife under the sink, in case, then decided it was too risky and relied on Nicholas's blade. She planned to wait in the bathroom so she wouldn't see it happen. They debated whether to cover Dee Dee's mouth. They worried about noise. Gypsy knew the creak in the hall and told him where to step. He memorized it like a spell. The night finally arrived. The house exhaled into quiet. Dee Dee swallowed her pills, checked the door, and turned off the lamp. Gypsy waited, then crept to the front door and slid the latch. Her hands shook as she texted Nicholas. Now. He was blocks away, heart pounding. Familiar sidewalks transformed into a maze. He wore a hoodie despite the heat. He kept his head down. He carried the knife tucked inside his waistband, the handle warm against his skin. He reached the pink house and slipped in. The air inside smelled like laundry soap and something sweet. He moved in the dark, stepping where Gypsy had told him. She met him at the bathroom door, their eyes locked. This was the line between talking and doing. She pressed a latex glove into his hand, then pulled him into the bathroom and closed the door. She handed him the knife. He whispered that his darker persona would handle it. She covered her ears. Texts stopped. Whispers replaced them. Gypsy pointed toward the bedroom. Nicholas opened the door slowly. The fan ticked in the corner. Dee Dee slept on her side. Blanket pulled to her shoulder. He stood above her and froze for a beat that could have been a lifetime. Then he moved. The first strike landed. Dee Dee jolted awake and fought, a sound in her throat that didn't make it to words. He stabbed again. The bed thumped against the wall. A dog barked somewhere on the street. Gypsy squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her palms hard to block the sounds. In the quiet between breaths, a final blow, and then stillness. He came back to the bathroom, chest heaving, hands slick. Gypsy opened her eyes and saw blood on the glove. She didn't ask if Dee Dee was dead. She didn't need to. They moved in a silent flurry, washing, wiping, tossing gloves into a bag. The house felt like it had tilted, a stage where props now meant something else. Gypsy went to her room and grabbed the wig, the dress, the phone, the cash, her stuffed animal. She looked once at the wheelchair and left it where it stood. Cleanup was more idea than reality. They tried to wipe door handles and light switches, but panic made their hands clumsy. Nicholas's footprint on a mat, a fingerprint on a drawer. These details didn't register. They stuck to the plan that had seemed clever earlier. Mail the knife away. Gypsy wrapped it in a towel and stuffed it into a padded envelope. She wrote an address in Wisconsin she knew Nicholas could reach later. She sealed it, thinking distance would make evidence disappear. They left the house before dawn, stepping out into air that felt too normal. They walked to a nearby post office drop and slid the envelope inside. The thunk echoed. They kept moving, lugging a backpack and a tote bag that held a life compressed into essentials and things that weren't essential at all. They didn't run. Running drew eyes. They walked like people who had a place to be. The bus station was fluorescent and humming. Gypsy wore her wig and a dress that made her look like a traveller, not a patient. She kept her head down and her voice low. They bought tickets and sat side by side, hands touching under a jacket. The bus pulled out, tires singing on the highway. Springfield receded. The pink house stayed behind, quiet as a crime scene no one had found yet. On the bus, adrenaline drained and talk returned. They whispered about the apartment they'd find, the meals they'd cook, the pets they'd adopt. Gypsy texted a friend from her alias account to plant a post from Dee Dee's Facebook later, a crude message that would draw attention to the house. It felt like a way to say the story was over. She didn't consider how it would read to neighbours. She pressed send anyway. A delay setting would post it later. In the hours that followed, the world began to move around them. Neighbours saw the post. Calls started. Police were dispatched. Officers saw the wheelchair untouched. and the oxygen by the door, and felt the hair on their necks lift. Meanwhile, Gypsy and Nicholas crossed state lines, trading a crime scene for bus station bathrooms and vending machines. They thought distance equaled safety. They reached Wisconsin and disappeared into Nicholas's small world, a house that didn't know what had arrived with him. They shut the door and felt relief, crest and crash. Gypsy ate real food without asking permission. She took a shower alone, water hot and free. She looked at herself in the mirror with no one in the next room. The plan had delivered her to a new life, but blood had been the price. Meanwhile, the internet started to speak. The post from Dee Dee's account had landed. The neighborhood gathered. Patrol cars parked under streetlights. The pink house glowed with red and blue. Gypsy imagined freedom as an empty calendar. The truth was tighter. Phones traced locations, ticket purchases left trails, and a paper envelope with a knife inside made its own journey. They didn't know yet that the bus they'd chosen would be a straight line for investigators to follow. The words appeared on Dee Dee's Facebook around mid-afternoon. "That bee is dead." Neighbors in the quiet subdivision saw it pop up, screens lighting living rooms and kitchens. At first, some thought it was a hack or a crude joke. Then a second comment, even more explicit, made it impossible to shrug off. People started calling each other, then calling the police. A few walked over and stood on the sidewalk, eyes flicking to the pink house with the trimmed lawn and the ramp everyone had helped build. Inside patrol cars, the call came through as a welfare check with unusual circumstances. Officers pulled up, took in the ramp, the decorations in the windows, the porch light glowing in daylight. A neighbor waved them over and pointed at the Facebook post on her phone. Another said she hadn't seen Gypsy outside in days. An officer knocked. No answer. Another tried the door. Locked. The neighbors tried to explain the house's rhythms, as if the details might help. Morning appointments, afternoon naps, a mother who never traveled. They made entry after getting permission and stepped into a room arranged like a hospital waiting area, had been dropped into a home. Medication organizers on a shelf. Oxygen tank by the door. The wheelchair parked near the couch. That chair shouldn't have been empty if Gypsy was gone. One officer called out. Another moved toward the hallway. A knife lay on the floor near the kitchen, out of place and too clean, like someone had started to do something with it and changed their mind. The bedroom door was closed. When they opened it, the air turned heavy. Dee Dee lay in bed, blood dark against sheets that had once been floral and bright. Outside, neighbors gathered in a loose circle. Someone started crying. Someone else called a local pastor. The house had been a community project, ramp days, donated furniture, a casserole rotation when hospital stays ran long. Now people watched patrol tapes stretch across familiar hedges. The wheelchair was carried outside by an officer and set on the porch so crime scene techs could work inside. It sat there like a question. Where was Gypsy if her mobility depended on that chair? Meanwhile, detectives were already moving to secure the digital trail. The Facebook post gave a timestamp and a place to start. They contacted Facebook, pulled IP logs, and got a location that didn't match the pink house. It pinged from Wisconsin. That turned worry into action. A missing person alert went out for Gypsy Rose Blanchard, female, teen to early 20s depending on which records you believed, medically fragile, possibly kidnapped. News crews arrived fast. The story sold itself. Beloved caregiver murdered. Disabled daughter missing. Inside the house, techs documented everything. They photographed the medication cabinet, noted the oxygen tank with dust on the valve, and bagged the knife from the kitchen as potential evidence separate from the murder weapon they recovered near the bedroom. They looked for signs of forced entry and found none. The front door's latch looked intact. Windows were closed. The scene suggested someone inside had let the killer in, or that the killer knew the routines well enough to get through quietly. Reporters went live from the curb. Viewers at home saw teddy bears in the window and police lights bouncing off the siding. A neighbor stepped to the microphone and said she'd known the family for years, that Gypsy was sweet and tiny and couldn't walk far, that Dee Dee was a saint. Another neighbor held back tears and said if anyone had taken Gypsy, they needed to bring her home because she needed her medications. People set up lawn chairs on porches and waited, eyes on the door, as if watching could make the next update arrive sooner. Detectives reviewed calls and messages from Dee Dee's phone and social accounts. The Facebook post had been sent through a device that wasn't in Missouri. That mattered. They requested emergency records, moved to subpoena bus station footage, and checked for rideshare trips. A small thread appeared. ticket purchases from Springfield to Wisconsin within the last 24 hours. They grabbed security footage and saw a young woman with a wig and a man in a hooded sweatshirt. The woman's gait didn't match the image of a wheelchair-bound daughter. They traced the IP to a house in Big Bend, Wisconsin. Local police in Wisconsin were briefed. The tone shifted over the radio. Missing person. Possible kidnapping. Possible suspect with the victim. Officers discussed approach. Whether medical assistance was needed. Whether to expect resistance. Back in Missouri, the community kept vigil. A neighbor who'd helped build the ramp gently ran a hand along its rail, like touching it might explain how the story had slipped sideways. As night fell, candles appeared on the sidewalk. People prayed, whispered, and updated each other with rumors. Someone said they saw a strange car last night. Someone else insisted they'd heard nothing. A woman brought bottled water and set it on a folding table. The porch light stayed on, washing the wheelchair in a soft glow that made it look like a person might wheel out any minute and explain a misunderstanding. In the house, detectives collected devices and found a small stack of envelopes and stamps near the kitchen. One padded envelope was missing, the adhesive tabs still on the counter. That detail felt odd, especially when paired with the knife count. It wasn't proof, but it suggested movement after the killing, not panic alone, but tasks. They bagged the adhesive tab. Forensics noted partial prints in several places, not all of them Dee Dee's. By dawn, the story had shifted on local news from kidnapping to mystery. The wheelchair on the porch, the oxygen inside, the confession-like Facebook post. None of it fit cleanly. The public alert got a fast update. If you see Gypsy Rose Blanchard, call police. She may be in danger, but she can walk. It was the first hint that the town's understanding of the family was breaking open. Then, the call came in from Wisconsin. Officers had eyes on a residence linked to the IP. They moved in carefully, knocked, then entered. Inside, they found Gypsy and Nicholas. She wasn't in a wheelchair. She was standing. She didn't look like a kidnapped teen. She looked like a person who had chosen to be there, terrified and relieved at the same time. Back in Missouri, the porch vigil learned within hours that Gypsy was alive. The shock didn't release the community. It tightened it. The perfect mother image fractured. The pink house, the ramp, the wheelchair on the porch, every symbol flipped. Then the truth started to surface. And it didn't look like a kidnapping. The first official words hit like cold water. Gypsy can walk. Investigators briefed local media carefully, then watched the town's face change. People who had carried casseroles and built ramps stared at their TVs. The wheelchair on the porch went from symbol of courage to evidence of something else. Officers in Wisconsin noted Gypsy moved without aid. She stood to answer the door. She sat at a kitchen table and asked for water. It wasn't a miracle. It was a contradiction that forced everyone to reframe the past. Police interviews began with basic facts. They needed to know if Gypsy had been taken against her will, if Nicholas had coerced her, and whether Dee Dee had enemies. Gypsy's answers were steady, almost relieved. She talked about years of control, the shaved head, the feeding tube, the staged medical visits. She said she ate in secret sometimes, pudding, soft foods. She admitted she could walk more than she'd ever been allowed to show. Detectives listened, then asked about the night of the killing. She didn't deny planning. She described waiting in the bathroom with her hands over her ears. In Springfield, detectives pulled medical records with a speed the system had never matched. They requested files from hospitals in Louisiana and Missouri, connected names that had lived in separate folders, and saw the pattern plain. Labs that were normal, studies that didn't match the diagnoses, a neurologist's note about suspected Munchausen by proxy, a social worker's visit that went nowhere. Pages from a dentist chart that lamented extractions for teeth that might have been salvageable if underlying causes were addressed differently. The paper trail that once embalmed Dee Dee's story now exposed it. Public statements shifted. Authorities told reporters Gypsy didn't have leukemia. There was no evidence of muscular dystrophy. She didn't need a wheelchair for mobility. That didn't mean she'd never had symptoms. It meant the diagnoses were unsupported, and the harm of unnecessary treatment was real. Volunteers felt anger bloom next to grief. People replayed conversations on porches and in pews, wondering how they'd missed it. Some blamed themselves. Others blamed the systems that had failed to connect warning signs. A detective in Wisconsin asked Gypsy what it felt like to eat after arriving. She said it felt normal and new at the same time. She'd had pizza. She'd had soda. She didn't cough or choke. She described brushing her teeth and seeing her gums bleed where years of poor care and medications had taken their toll. She talked about a shower, without supervision. The details were small, but each one revealed a life that had been narrowed to fit a script. Meanwhile, Nicholas gave his version. He framed himself as a rescuer answering a call. He spoke about personas, about being guided by a darker protector, about love. He didn't hide the stabbing. He described it bluntly. He believed he had saved Gypsy from an abuser. Detectives saw two truths pressed together: a woman who'd been abused and trapped, and a man who'd committed a brutal murder. The law would have to hold both at once. Back in Missouri, the community's sense of betrayal had layers. A neighbor who'd wheeled the chair to the porch vigil the night before struggled to process that the girl she'd pushed wasn't bound to it. Church members remembered Dee Dee's tears and the prayer chains for surgeries that, in hindsight, may not have been necessary. Make-A-Wish volunteers who'd helped with trips felt used. A nurse who'd once whispered, "You seem stronger than you look," now wished she'd pushed harder. Reporters asked medical experts to explain Munchausen by proxy. They talked about caregiver-fabricated illness, about attention and control, about the paradox of a devoted parent whose devotion harms. They explained how fragmented records let a narrative travel unchallenged. They noted that some signs had been documented but never connected, red flags that didn't turn into sirens. The town listened and looked again at the pink house, now a crime scene with tape peeling in the Sunday. Police walked through the timeline with Gypsy. They asked when she'd realized her age. She described the birth certificate, the tremor in her hands. They asked about the Facebook post. She admitted it was meant to draw attention, to ensure her mother was found, to make the past end decisively. The wording had been crude on purpose. She wanted it loud. She hadn't thought about how it would land on neighbors' screens. Medical records filled the gaps. A pediatric specialist's old note read, "No evidence of muscular dystrophy." A sleep study showed normal oxygenation. A lab panel didn't support leukemia. A GI consult advised caution about feeding tube dependence, recommending steps toward oral intake. Those steps never happened. Another physician had written, "Caregiver reports seizure activity not observed in clinical settings." In one place, a doctor had flagged suspected MBP. Without enforcement, it became another page in a binder. Detectives didn't treat Gypsy like a hostage. They treated her like a participant. Still, they noted her posture, her answers, the relief that kept slipping through. She didn't ask for a lawyer right away. She wanted to explain. She wanted to be seen outside the chair, and the child's voice. The human contradiction was stark. A person both harmed by years of medical abuse and present in the planning of a killing. Announcements to the public got sharper. The sheriff's office said Gypsy could walk and wasn't in immediate medical danger. They encouraged people to wait for details before judging. That didn't stop talk shows from filling the gaps with outrage, sympathy, or both. The town's narrative shifted from kidnapped disabled daughter to abused daughter complicit in murder. Each frame came with different villains and victims, and the truth sat messier in the middle. Gypsy's first night in custody didn't come with machines or alarms. It came with standard intake, a cot, and food she didn't have to pretend to struggle with. She cried when a nurse asked routine medical questions and didn't look to Dee Dee for answers. She stood for her mugshot. She stared into the camera and looked older than she'd ever been allowed to be. Investigators mapped the ripple effects. Charities reviewed vetting processes. Hospitals examined how they handle caregiver-controlled narratives. Social workers revisited thresholds for intervention. Each institution saw itself in a fragment of the story and wondered what might have changed if they'd pushed harder or talked to each other. It wasn't just a family's lie. It was a system's blind spot. The motive conversation began. Was this murder about freedom? About fear? About the collapse of options in a house where the only open door led to a crime? Prosecutors weighed intent and history. Detectives kept chasing details, bus tickets, the mailed knife, the texts that bridged fantasy and action. Parallel to Gypsy's interviews, Nicholas doubled down on his role as avenger. He believed he'd done what love required. The law didn't see it that way. The question wasn't just who killed Dee Dee. It was what made that outcome possible. Charging decisions started with the same night, but split fast. Prosecutors in Missouri looked at text messages, bus tickets, the knife in a mailed envelope, and a body stabbed multiple times in bed. They also looked at years of medical fabrication, documented across multiple systems. They filed second-degree murder and armed criminal action against Gypsy Rose Blanchard, signaling intent without premeditation's highest weight. For Nicholas Godejohn, they went for first-degree murder and armed criminal action. The theory was clear. He did the killing, and he planned it. In the plea discussions, stakes felt human and heavy. Gypsy's defense team brought binders of medical records, notes from physicians who suspected caregiver fabrication, and interviews describing shaved heads, feeding tubes, and threats. They explained Munchausen by proxy in simple language for a courtroom that would need to feel the control, not just hear it. Prosecutors didn't dismiss the abuse. They weighed it against texts where Gypsy and Nicholas discussed timing, gloves, and silence. In July 2016, Gypsy took a plea. Second-degree murder, 10 years in the Missouri Department of Corrections. In court, her voice wasn't childlike. She answered the judge's questions plainly. Yes, she understood the charge. Yes, she understood the sentence. Yes, she was pleading guilty. The narrative in the public square split. Some called the deal harsh for a victim of long-term abuse. Others said a life had been taken in a calculated act. The law did what it often does with complicated facts. It threaded a middle, acknowledging harm and insisting on accountability. Evidence presented around her plea hinted at what would come in Nicholas's trial. The texts showed clear planning. Photos from the bus station captured Gypsy walking. A postal clerk remembered a padded envelope mailed after the killing. Forensics tied the murder weapon to Nicholas. Still, the courtroom would need to hear from him, to see whether a jury could accept his claim that he was a rescuer acting out a plan he believed was righteous. Nicholas rejected any plea that equated to life. His attorneys raised mental health early. They noted his autism spectrum diagnosis, his reported cognitive limitations, and his descriptions of alternate personas guiding him. They filed for a change of venue, worried about pre-trial publicity, and got it. The trial moved to a courtroom where jurors hadn't watched the Pink House every night on the news. Prosecutors built their case like a sequence. Messages that escalated from fantasy to logistics. Bus tickets purchased. Gloves and a knife packed. A door left unlocked. A mother stabbed in bed. A cleanup attempt. A mailed knife. A flight to Wisconsin. A Facebook post that drew police. They called detectives to walk jurors through phone extractions and IP traces. They called medical experts to explain MBP so jurors could understand context, but emphasized that context didn't negate choice. The defense leaned on mental state. They called psychologists who testified about autism, social naivete, and susceptibility to influence. They suggested Nicholas struggled to separate role play from reality, that he lacked the capacity to plan like a typical offender. They emphasized Gypsy's power in the relationship, her knowledge of the house, her timing of medications, her invitation. If he was a weapon, they said, he was one placed in a hand by someone else. Cross-examination pressed contradictions. Nicholas had enough foresight to bring gloves, to step around creaky boards, to mail a knife. He'd left few signs of confusion in the precise violence of the attack. Jurors watched a recording where he described stabbing Dee Dee without flinching, recounting details a rescuer might avoid saying out loud. The prosecution didn't have to erase his challenges to win. They had to convince jurors he'd formed intent and acted on it. Family testimony complicated the picture further. Relatives from Louisiana spoke in measured tones about Dee Dee's past. Alleged financial fraud with an elderly mother's checkbook, control that predated Gypsy's birth, a move that followed conflict. None of it was charged conduct, but it painted a lineage of manipulation. It explained the world Nicholas walked into the night he crossed that bedroom threshold. It didn't absolve the blade in his hand. The jury instructions drew a line. First-degree murder required deliberation, cool reflection, however brief. The judge explained that planning could be formed quickly. It didn't require days. Second degree, the fallback, required knowing intent to kill without deliberation's weight. The jurors held the texts, the travel, the knife, the waiting, the attack against those definitions. They took a few hours to decide. They returned with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. The court sentenced Nicholas to life without parole, plus a term for the weapons count. Public reaction mirrored the case's contradictions. Some saw justice, a man who stabbed a sleeping woman held fully accountable. Others saw a failure to integrate mental health and coercive control into a verdict that allowed for nuance. Commentators debated whether autism had been weaponized by both sides, by the defense to argue diminished capacity, and by the prosecution to show it didn't erase deliberation. For Gypsy, the plea's impact was immediate and strange. Prison meant fewer medications and no oxygen mask at night. It meant GED classes, library shifts, and interviews where she could finally speak in her own voice. In statements, prosecutors said the 10-year sentence reflected a balance: the horror of a killing, the proof of prolonged abuse, and the need to deter violence as problem-solving. Her supporters argued the system had punished the person it had failed to protect. Even some critics agreed on one thing. The plea spared her a trial that would have dissected her life in a way no survivor asks for. In sentencing arguments, both cases returned to records. The MVP context didn't vanish because a verdict landed. It was weighed. Judges acknowledged it in remarks and orders. Prosecutors referenced it while insisting on accountability. Defense teams used it to humanize clients without erasing victims. Dee Dee's death remained a homicide. Gypsy's life remained a lesson in how unchecked control can warp choices until they look like the only ones left. In the aftermath, another story took shape. Who gets to tell it? The day after Nicholas's sentence, cameras were still pointed at the pink house, but the story had already moved to screens. HBO's Mommy Dead and Dearest arrived first with interviews that let Gypsy speak in her own voice from prison. She described the shaving, the feeding tube, the bathroom on the night of the murder. Viewers saw her not as a silhouette behind a wheelchair, but as a woman navigating a mess without clean heroes. It reframed the case from a simple true crime to a reckoning with coercive control and the costs of escape. Hulu's The Act followed. A dramatized retelling with actors who turned internet facts into scenes. The series captured the pastel world, the baby voice, the blue Cinderella dress, and the whispering plans after midnight. It took liberties for story, compressing timelines, inventing dialogue, smoothing rough edges into arcs. Audiences binged it, and then went searching for source material, backfilling memory with documentary footage and court transcripts. The line between the real Gypsy and the character people felt they knew blurred in comment sections. Gypsy's image split across media frames. In interviews from prison, she was measured, almost formal, describing both love for her mother and relief after the murder. She said she felt freer behind bars than in that house. That sentence traveled fast because it contained contradiction people could hold. In another segment, she talked about food, about walking, about learning boundaries, normal things that sounded radical after years of medical scripts. She didn't cry much on camera. Instead, she tried to explain. Public reaction broke in predictable places. Some viewers extended deep sympathy. A child had been medically abused for years. The system had failed. The only exit looked violent. Others focused on the bedroom and the knife, warning that empathy shouldn't erase accountability. Talk shows put experts on panels to explain Munchausen by proxy and trauma bonding. The phrases coercive control and medical child abuse entered mainstream language, though not always with precision. Meanwhile, memes flattened it. Cinderella, in a wheelchair with barbed captions, dark jokes about Facebook posts. The internet turned suffering into content and then into culture. Ethical debates weren't just academic. Families of MBP survivors wrote op-eds about being doubted by clinicians and disbelieved by relatives. Nurses talked about training gaps. Physicians admitted how easily complex cases slide into deference. The question echoed, how do you protect a child when a parent's narrative masks harm? The case became a reference point for grand rounds, social work trainings, and policy meetings. It also became a commodity: documentaries, podcasts, dramatizations, listicles. Every retelling competed to own the lens. Advocacy followed the attention. Medical organizations published guidelines on caregiver-fabricated illness, urging cross-institutional record reviews and multidisciplinary teams. Social service agencies piloted checklists that flagged inconsistent histories and caregiver behaviors, doctor shopping, exaggerated symptoms, resistance to school enrollment. Hospitals emphasized second opinions before invasive procedures when histories conflicted with tests. None of it promised a cure for the blind spots, but it signaled the system had been changed by the case's glare. Inside prison, Gypsy built an adult life for the first time. She earned her GED, took classes, and sat for interviews that required her to define herself beyond victim and defendant. She talked about trauma therapy and learning to name what she'd lived through without letting it be the only thing about her. She received letters, some supportive, some inappropriate, some exploitative. She learned to set boundaries on paper, because there were few other ways to practice. She also faced a quieter cost that isn't easy television. Years of medications had thinned her bones and damaged her teeth. Dental work became part of her plan for release. She talked about anxiety, not as a headline but as a feeling that ambushed her in fluorescent rooms. She missed birthdays she didn't know she'd had. In interviews, she said she was relearning how to make choices without permission, simple ones like what to wear, and larger ones like whom to trust. By 2023, the countdown to release stirred a new wave of media. Some corners of the internet treated it like a celebrity homecoming, stan accounts posting photos, edits, and declarations of love. Others warned against glamorizing a homicide. Journalists negotiated access agreements. Gypsy walked out, married her fiancé, and stepped into a world that had been watching her long before she could see it. Paparazzi shots landed next to clips of her first trips to a grocery store. The contrast was jarring. Private recovery turned into public spectacle. She tried to own the narrative without turning it into a product. In statements, she focused on prevention and healing. She said prison had been strange freedom, and that release was a different kind, louder, messier, with choices she'd never practiced. She spoke about therapy and the work of untangling love from harm. She didn't make Dee Dee a monster. She also didn't excuse what had been done. That balance, accountability without erasure, wasn't neat, but it matched the life she had to live. Meanwhile, the true crime economy moved on a familiar track. Podcasts dissected text messages and bus routes. YouTube essays layered commentary over footage of the Pink House. Some creators led with nuance, centering medical abuse and systemic failure. Others leaned into sensational beats. The Facebook post, the bathroom, the blade. The algorithm rewarded extremes. In that noise, a few steady voices kept returning to the paperwork, the clinics, the nurses who suspected, and the notes that might have saved her sooner if anyone had stitched them together. The case sparked reforms, but also a cultural habit of seeing villains and victims in high contrast. Advocates urged a different lens. Harm can be real without being simple. They pushed for skepticism that isn't cruelty, questions that keep kids safe without punishing families for being complicated. They asked viewers to watch stories like this, and then ask what in their town, their clinic, their school would catch the next Gypsy before the tunnel ends in blood. For Gypsy, the first months outside were full of small, ordinary victories that reporters glanced past. Picking toothpaste, calling a friend without hiding the phone, saying no because she wanted to, not because someone else decided. She posted carefully, aware that the same internet that once gave her a door also watched for missteps. She met with supporters and critics. She stayed off scripts whenever she could. Ethics lingered. Should studios profit from her life? Should her voice be the one to lead? Was all this attention a second exploitation? There were no clean answers. She made choices anyway, some on camera, some not. The story that had been controlled by a mother, then by courts, then by networks, was finally being narrated by the person who had lived it most closely. It didn't resolve the crime. It didn't erase the harm. It made space for a survivor to grow in public, with all the risk that entails. But one piece still lingers. Could this have been stopped? The case exposed how many guardrails were painted on, not built. Start with medical records. In 2 states, across multiple hospitals, Gypsy's file existed as fragments. One clinic had the sleep study, another had neurology notes. A third logged feeding tube changes. No one stitched them into a single story. Without a unified record, each new doctor skimmed the latest page and inherited the oldest myth. A diagnosis like muscular dystrophy sat there like a sticky note that never fell off. It takes time to challenge a label. In busy clinics, time is what no one has. Doctor shopping exploited that. When results didn't match symptoms, Dee Dee moved on. Systems didn't flag the pattern. Insurers saw claims, not context. Medicaid approvals rolled through because paperwork looked complete. Prior authorization confirmed necessity on forms, not in bodies. A red flag queue for high-utilization pediatric cases with inconsistent objective findings would have slowed the carousel. It didn't exist where it needed to. A pediatrician's uneasy note in Missouri should have pinged a neurologist in Louisiana. Silence traveled faster. Social services faced limits baked into law. A single home visit asks, is a child in imminent danger? In a tidy house with a loving-seeming parent and stacks of prescriptions, the answer leans no. Dee Dee rehearsed for those moments. She controlled the script, the documents, the access. Without an eyewitness to direct harm, or a child willing to contradict a caregiver, cases closed. Mandated reporters filed concerns that never met the threshold to remove. The standard protects parental rights. It can trap a child when abuse hides in medical language. Law enforcement met the same glass wall. A wellness check isn't a search warrant. Officers can look, listen, and leave. They don't adjudicate diagnoses. When a mother presents hospital wristbands and a calendar of specialist appointments, they document and step out. Hunches die without probable cause. Even after Dr. Flasterstein documented suspected Munchausen by proxy, the pathway from note to coordinated action wasn't automatic. It relied on phone calls and goodwill, not mandatory multi-agency review. School is often where patterns crack. There was no school. Homeschooling, done right, is normal. Done as a cloak, it isolates. Oversight is light in many places. An affidavit, a curriculum list, a yearly check that doesn't require seeing the child. Age manipulation deepened the cover. A shaved head and a soft voice made Gypsy look younger. Dee Dee's changed birth years slipped past clerks who focused on forms, not faces. A truancy officer would have asked different questions if attendance had been required. The community's kindness created cover. Charity vetting leaned on physician letters and visible need. A ramp build feels like certainty. We saw the chair. We built the solution. No one is trained to ask whether a wheelchair is a prop. People assume someone upstream has verified everything. That diffusion of responsibility put a halo on the house. Reporters told feel-good stories because audiences like relief, not friction. Praise smothered doubt. Inside clinics, red flags appeared and flickered out. Normal labs with severe symptom reports. A child whose exam suggested near-normal strength. A caregiver who dominated talk, redirected questions, and bristled at second opinions. There were notes of concern, but few escalations. Not because clinicians didn't care, because the escalation ladder wasn't sturdy. A single suspected MVP line needed a trigger. Mandatory case conference, automatic record aggregation, supervisory sign-off before invasive procedures. Those mechanisms were patchy. Concrete reforms are thinkable because the misses were specific. Build cross-state pediatric record exchanges that pull problem lists, key labs, and flagged concerns into a one-page dashboard every time a child registers. Create MVP checklists for clinicians that move suspicion from vibes to criteria. Caregiver behavior patterns, history test mismatches, procedure frequency, school avoidance. When thresholds hit, root cases to multidisciplinary teams, medicine, social work, law. Make it policy, not preference. Insurers can help without acting like gatekeepers slamming doors. Flag high-utilization pediatric cases with conflicting diagnoses for clinical audit by independent pediatric specialists. Require second opinions before repeating invasive procedures when objective findings are absent. Fund care coordinators for complex cases who aren't beholden to a single hospital, neutral parties who track big-picture narratives and ask grounding questions. What is proven? What is assumed? What changed? Social services need tools beyond one-off visits. Authorize extended observation in medical settings when MVP is suspected. Time where staff can see caregiver-child dynamics without rehearsal. Train workers to interview children separately with trauma-informed approaches that reduce fear of contradicting a parent. Give caseworkers access to the cross-institution dashboard so they aren't walking in blind, relying on whatever binder the caregiver brings. Law enforcement benefits from a narrow, protective lever. A judicial mechanism to order temporary medical record consolidation and independent review when a mandated reporter flags suspected caregiver-fabricated illness. Not a criminal raid, an evidence-gathering pause that protects a child's body from unnecessary procedures while experts look. Pair that with prosecutor training on medical child abuse so they can translate clinical patterns into legal action when needed. Schools, traditional or homeschool oversight, can build soft verification. Annual in-person wellness checks, coordinated with pediatricians for families claiming medical necessity for homeschooling, offer services instead of sanctions. Tutoring at home, special education evals, nurse visits. The presence of other adults creates observational windows. Communities can shift culture without losing compassion. Charity boards can add a due diligence step for large, ongoing support cases. A confidential medical validation through hospital social work, rather than a letter handed over by the caregiver. Newsrooms can treat perfect stories as invitations to ask gentle, deeper questions. Praise the child's resilience more than the caregiver's sacrifice. Clinically, embed diagnostic timeouts. Before renewing a serious label annually, teams pause. What evidence confirms this? What's alternative? Has any objective finding ever matched the narrative? If not, retest or de-escalate. Involve ethics committees when caregiver behavior complicates care. Name MVP explicitly in charts when criteria are met. Euphemisms hide risk. None of this prevents every case. MVP is rare, and most caregivers telling complex stories are honest and exhausted. The goal isn't suspicion as default, it's structured skepticism, systems that can hold care and questions in the same hand. If even one of these rails had been stronger, a unified record, a team review after the neurologist's note, a school's in-person check, Gypsy's tunnel might have ended in a courtroom for protection, not a bedroom with a knife. There's a micro scene that sticks. A nurse, chart open, pausing at a normal lab, and an alarming history. wanting to push, lacking a door to knock on. Give her that door. Make the knock mandatory, the room staffed, the minutes protected. Build the habit where the next child in a chair that shouldn't be necessary is seen walking sooner, not after a body is found. She stepped out to cameras, flashbulbs crackling like summer insects. Freedom didn't feel like a parade. It felt like air without permission. Family gathered quick, hugs that were careful with bones thinned by years of medication, tears that mixed relief with grief for time gone. She wore jeans that fit an adult, not a costume for a child. A ring on her hand signaled a new chapter. Marriage came with public curiosity, as if love after a crime needed a permit. Days filled with firsts that weren't dramatic on paper. A grocery store aisle with 20 kinds of cereal. She paused, laughed quietly, and chose one without asking anyone. Walking from the car to the door without rehearsing weakness. A dentist appointment that wasn't framed by pity. Dental work would be a long road. Years of medication and neglect had done their slow damage. She booked therapy and kept showing up, naming what had no words in the pink house. Coercive control, medical child abuse, grief for a mother who caused harm, and was still her mother. Public reception split in predictable ways. Some reached out with fierce support, calling her survival a testimony. Others resented the attention, worried we were celebrating homicide. She didn't control the show. Interviews made headlines out of sentences she meant as context. She learned to speak carefully and then to stop speaking sometimes. Her voice, once trained to be small, found a steady middle. She avoided myth-making. She said she was responsible for what she'd done and that she was also shaped by what was done to her. Both were true, both were heavy. There were practical consequences. Parole rules, check-ins, a map of where she could travel, a budget newly real. She took on simple tasks with the focus of someone who'd had even simpler tasks supervised. Cooking without measuring out pills, choosing a doctor who wasn't a gatekeeper of identity, signing her own forms. She kept a small notebook of reminders that would be second nature to others. Renew ID, schedule cleaning, call therapist, water plants. Life became a series of earned routines. Media requests didn't stop. Some offers felt predatory, some felt careful. She said yes to a few, no to most. She talked about prevention when asked for spectacle. She didn't offer absolution for herself or for Nicholas. She didn't vilify Dee Dee in one-dimensional strokes either. The healthiest thing she could do was sit with complexity in public and refuse to turn it into content that rewarded extremes. That stance disappointed people who wanted a heroine or a villain. It spared her from becoming either. She kept in touch with relatives in Louisiana, repairing strands that had frayed under Dee Dee's relocations and lies. They swapped stories to build a shared record, the small, warm memories that could coexist with the dark ones. She visited a park without calculating wheelchair ramp angles and sat on a bench until the sun moved. The body kept score. Anxiety still spiked in fluorescent spaces, in hospital smell echoes, in paperwork that asked for medical histories. Therapy gave her language and tools. She practiced using both. Internet stan culture spun anyway. Edits cast her as an icon. Threads scolded her as a cautionary tale. She resisted both. The only audience she tried to keep was the younger version of herself who had learned to be agreeable to survive. She wanted that girl to see an adult making choices without fear. Boundaries were the new oxygen. She set them with family, with friends, with strangers who treated trauma like a meet and greet. The pink house stayed empty. The ramp grey-weathered, a path to a door that wouldn't open. It became a landmark on true crime maps, and a reminder in the neighborhood of how kindness can be misled. Gypsy didn't visit. Not because she erased the past, because some places don't offer anything you can use going forward. She carried the house in muscle memory anyway. Which floorboard creaked, how pills sounded in a bottle, the way a porch light can look like safety from the street. Accountability lived beside empathy. She didn't ask people to pick one. She asked systems to learn. She met with clinicians and social workers who wanted to get it right next time. She encouraged friends online to trust instincts when stories don't add up. Prevention became her way of paying a debt she couldn't fully settle. It didn't undo the bedroom. It made meaning from it, which is sometimes all survivors can do. One evening, she walked to a corner store with her husband. No wig, no performance. A kid held the door for her. She said thanks and meant it. Quiet moments like that didn't trend. They built a life anyway. One decision ended a lie and started another life.